Welcome everyone, this is FUC Pay Us. This is our weekly online speaker series facilitated by rent-burdened graduate students at UC Irvine in solidarity with the UC-wide cost of living COLA movement. Tom and I certainly believe that this is a time for sort of strong language, but we also alternatingly use our initialism FYPU. The acronym, your best guess is as good as ours. So I am Molly Thrailkill. I am a graduate student of visual studies at Irvine. My co-facilitator, Thomas Williams, is a graduate student in English. Our mission with this series is to both widen the visibility of the COLA movement across the UC, but also to create a space for conversations around labor movements, as well as the future of higher education and the university. For more information, to see recordings of our previous talks, please visit our website or contact us, and then Tom should drop all that information into the chat shortly. So I also want to note that in terms of my position with Tom, Tom and I really view our role as facilitators here as pretty much just that. We are here to provide our energy, our resources to grow this platform so that these conversations and vital discussions can take place. Above all, we are here to listen and learn alongside you all. So to that end, I want to read a recent press release written by our comrades at UCI, and then I'll move to introduce our speakers for this week. So this is a press release that was issued June 30th, 2020, just a few days ago. In December 2019, UC Santa Cruz graduate students officially began a grading strike after their demands for a desperately needed cost of living adjustment, COLA, were ignored by administration. By February 2020, all 10 University of California campuses had launched their own campaigns to fight for a COLA, which calls attention to the deep disparity between the importance of graduate students to the university and the hardship of student living conditions across UC campuses. While UC Santa Cruz strikers have received support from faculty, students, and staff all across the country, the UC system has continued to escalate their retaliation, resorting to police violence and threats of deportation. UC Santa Cruz also filed student conduct charges against several COLA organizers, with students receiving discipline as harsh as 2-year-long suspensions. Finally, 42 Santa Cruz graduate students have had further employment blocked by campus administration, even though grades had been submitted. On Thursday, February 20th, over 200 UC Irvine graduate students and supporters marched and rallied in solidarity with Santa Cruz strikers to demand cops off campus and to call attention to the high cost of living in Irvine, where students also pay an unjust percentage of their income toward rent and live paycheck to paycheck. In response, the UCI Chancellor's office refused to meet with students, locked down the administration building for 48 hours, and created a hostile environment with heightened police presence in response to a peaceful protest. UCI Police Department used force on several students, aggressively arresting a Black woman unaffiliated with the action who was merely attempting to retrieve a copy of her transcript. We firmly believe that the individual's arrest on February 20th is indicative of the anti-Blackness that pervades UC Irvine and the UC system as a whole. On June 29th, UC Irvine launched student conduct investigations against some of the students who partook in the February 20th action. The latest issuance of student conduct charges reaffirms UCI's unrelenting refusal to respond to its own graduate students' demands for the bare minimum of racial and economic justice, a livable wage. Since the campaign for a cost of living COLA began, students have been pushing the UC system to address the housing crisis faced by its students and workers and provide for our most basic needs. Now, in the midst of a global health pandemic and the worst economic depression since the 1930s that has only exacerbated students' precarity, UCI chooses to criminalize its students instead of addressing the very real needs that led them to strike to begin with. As was the case with Santa Cruz, these student conduct charges are an attempt to suppress free speech by cultivating a climate of fear and intimidation. These charges are sickly ironic in light of the fact that UCI's Chancellor, Howard Gilman, has studied and published about free speech on college campuses. Adding another layer of shameful contradiction is the fact that one of the first students charged with conduct violation was, in the same month, selected by UCI as the campus-wide awardee for outstanding social justice activism, for the very reasons for which UCI is now taking disciplinary action. UCI for COLA continues to unequivocally support the demands of UCI's Black Student Union and United Students Against Sweatshops, including the release of Officer Trish Harding's body camera footage from the 2020 action, February 20th. so that everyone can more fully understand what truly happened that day. We also demand that UCI administration and Chancellor Howard Gilman drop all student conduct charges against UCI students who partook in the February 2020 solidarity action to demand racial and economic justice. So an update since this release was issued is that the student conduct charges against organizers at UCI have been dropped. However, UCI must still address United Students Against Sweatshops and the Black Student Union's demands that come out of the February 20th action. We further sort of want to note that Santa Cruz must also rescind all of the disciplinary actions taken against organizers on their campus, the most egregious of which is, again, the 2-year suspension given to Carlos, who is a first generation PhD student of color and COLA for All organizer. So, and then I have some action items that I think Tom will also drop into the chat to follow up to that. So I want to sort of close my sort of introduction there and move to sort of introduce our speakers for today. We are very grateful to be joined by Davarian Baldwin, the Paul rather, Distinguished Professor of American Studies at Trinity College, and Adom Getachew, who is the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Political Science in the college at the University of Chicago. So thank you both so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you for having us. I just want to start by saying solidarity with the COLA movement. It was an incredible, action and movement that you all have built in the UC system, and I look forward to seeing what comes of it as we move into the new academic year. So it's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon and to have an opportunity to share some work that Davarian and I have been doing together. So I'm going to do a slight introduction, and what we're going to do for a little bit is go back and forth. So both Davarian and I are part of a formation, a network called Scholars for Social Justice. It's a kind of led by scholars of color. It emerged just 3 years ago, and it emerged in a context very much like our own, a moment of intense political mobilization out in the world, again, with the movement for Black Lives being at the center of that moment, as it is in our own moment, and that mobilization in the streets also, seeping into the college context, into the university context, and beginning to in a context in which students, and particularly students of color, were beginning to ask a whole set of questions about the limits of the diversity inclusion model of how race and racial hierarchy are dealt with on various campuses. So Scholars for Social Justice broadly is a formation of scholars that has two aims in mind. One is to support movement activists and organizers through especially political education. So we have a connection with the Movement for Black Lives and a coalition called the Rising Majority. And there we largely support the work of those activists and organizing formations. But we also have this attempt to try and bring the analysis of racial hierarchy and injustice that movement organizers have developed out in the world into the university sphere. So what we want to talk to you today about broadly is a project called Reparations in Higher Education, which is that attempt, right? That attempt to bring the kind of newly circulating and recirculating language of reparations into the university sphere. You might be familiar with the various ways in which universities have been prompted to study their history with the slave past, and to begin to reckon with that past in various kinds of ways. Most prominently a couple of years ago, Georgetown University, but a few others since then. So the Reparations in Higher Ed project, as Scholars for Social Justice frames it and imagines it, is that one, it can't be a simple reckoning with that moment of slavery only. So for instance, my own institution, University of Chicago, loves to say that it was formed after slavery. So it has no relationship to that slave past, right? So we want to first think about what the university is responsible for repairing, expanding that beyond just the history and connection to the slave past, and thinking about a longer history of racial domination that the university is involved with, and Davarian will lay out how we're thinking about that. Two, we want to connect the project of reparations to larger struggles in and around campuses, from labor organizing of the kind that you all are engaged with, to divestment strategies that especially undergraduate student activists have been advocating, to questions about indebtedness and the relationship between the university and mass incarceration. So I will put I'll put in the chat a link to our broader platform, and you can see how we're thinking about all of these things together. But I think I think basically the way we're framing it is to push back against the quick depoliticization of the reparations question in the university context, so that, for instance, Georgetown's repair project can be limited to something like legacy status for the children of the descendants of those who were sold by Georgetown, right? So we want to think more expansively and radically about what it would mean for the university to repair. So I'm going to turn it over to Davarian now, who's just going to lay out like what our analysis of the university is, what we're thinking about as the political economy of the university, and then we can talk more about what that repair model and vision looks like.
Thank you, Adom. So first of all, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm in solidarity with you all as we begin to think differently, not just about universities, but about the world more broadly. And with that in mind, just want to pause and think about the degree to which right before our eyes, universities have become this powerful force in our lives in ways that move far beyond simply teaching classes and writing books. Consider that the University of Southern California is the largest employer in the county of Los Angeles, in LA County. NYU and Columbia are two of the largest landholders on the island of Manhattan. The University of Chicago is the second largest, holds the second largest police force in the world. Again, the second largest police force in the world, only behind Vatican City, with jurisdiction over 65,000 non-student residents. So this is the reality that we're living in right now in terms of the growing influence and impact of universities on, in my work, focusing on urban life, but I think we could also talk about their impact on rural or suburban life as well. As we talk about this, some people see this in the rise of the growth of universities as something to celebrate, that they become this central fulcrum within our current economy. But we pay less attention to the working class neighborhoods and communities of color that largely surround these universities. They serve in certain ways as canaries in the coal mine of the conditions that we will all be facing in a very short time when it comes to the unchecked and unfettered growth of universities in terms of growing and controlling our cities. Just consider, for example, it's these individuals in these neighborhoods whose homes are being displaced when campuses expand into their neighborhoods. It's these residents who work for low wages and unfair treatment, not as faculty, but on the grounds crew and in food services at universities. And it's these communities who endure greater forms of police surveillance when campus police, the jurisdiction of police, of campus police, private police, extend into their neighborhoods. And so we need to draw a very clear attention to this reality that higher education is not only just emerging as this powerful place of knowledge, but they are becoming the most dominant force in the economic development and urban governance of our metropolitan lives, or what I call in my work, the rise of universities. So originally this analysis that we're bringing forth came out of my forthcoming book, In the Shadow of the Ivy Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities. But I always knew it was driven by what was going on in the street. And it's been quite the blessing to be able to take this work and put it in service to what's happening right now with Movement for Black Lives, with the Juneteenth movement, with what's happening right now around Divest Invest, around the Dreamers. It's taken on a much bigger resonance because of movements in the street. So with that in mind, we must ask the question, how do we get here? how do we get here not only to the rise of universities having such a dominant force, but how do we get to a reparations analysis of universities' impact on our cities? Well, Adom already mentioned the first leg to stand on is the realm of the colonial or antebellum period, slavery. We've talked about that. People know about that, so I won't go too much into that. But there are three others that bring us to the present. There are three other critical historical moments where universities have been given or have taken political and economic power that's had a profound impact on our lives. The second kind of leg is the progressive era. The third is the Cold War. And the fourth is the present. So real briefly, during the progressive era, we have the rise of the Morrill Act of 1862 and 1890. This was an act that has primarily been celebrated in mainstream circles as the period where we find the democratization of higher education, that working men and women were able to gain access to higher ed because of the rise of land grant institutions. So what happened with land grant institutions? What happened was that the federal government deeded land, public land, to states to serve as the basic endowment for land grant institutions. And this is what happened in 1860. In 1892, this land grant act included Jim Crow or former Confederate states to build higher education institutions in their domains. But what we don't look at in this Morrill Act is that the land that was deeded to these states was actually originally indigenous land that was taken, that was seized. And the profits and the wealth of that land still sits on the federal budgets of many states to this day, many universities to this day. And then if we look at the 1890 Act, what happened was that when these institutions were built in the South, in the former Confederate South, the federal government, to their credit, said that these new schools could not put a racially discriminatory clause in their admissions policies. But what the federal government did do was they gave these southern states additional monies so they could build separate historically Black colleges and universities that became another way of reinforced segregation. So in a very powerful way, the federal government, through higher education, the federal government reinforced Jim Crow in that critical progressive period through the funding of land grant institutions. Period 3, during the Cold War. During the Cold War, we find the Federal Housing Act of 1949, what some have called the Urban Renewal Act. Well, with the Federal Urban Renewal Act of 49, there was this additional clause called the 112 Credits Clause that was instituted about 6 years after the 49 Act. What this clause did was that it offered additional monies to any urban development project that was led by an institution of higher education. What it gave was 2-to-1 credit. So for example, if a city offered $50, the federal government would put in $100 to add to higher education-led urban renewal projects. What were the consequences of this? The consequences of this is this gave urban universities federal money to engage in the demolition of Black and brown communities that surrounded their neighborhoods because they were fearing what we call now the urban crisis. So they replaced these communities with buildings, university buildings, producing the kind of science and technology that was being so critical during the Cold War. This period saw the rise of Columbia's expansion in New York, UPenn Science Center, the University of Chicago's expansion in Kenwood and in Woodlawn, as well as farther west, the creation of the Aurora campus at the University of Colorado, Denver. So this act federally underwrote the demolition of Black and brown communities in the name of higher education. And finally, if we look at the present, we can see the convergence between higher education and what's become the knowledge economy, the degree to which higher education has become the new face of capitalism. Through tech transfer institutions and research districts, we see that through knowledge economy, in short, this phenomena where university science technology research is being sold to the private market to produce wealth, both for the city in which the school is located and for the university. This has become the centerpiece of today's economy. And so universities have become the new face of capitalism in a very clear way. And so what this convergence and this shift to the knowledge-based economy has had an adverse effect on the existing communities of color that still surround these universities, these campuses. Why? Because colleges and universities that engage in this economy remain tax exempt. So what you have now, for example, Adom can speak to this as well from her own experiences. You look at some place like Yale University, situated in New Haven, Connecticut. So you have federally underwritten wealth in the Yale Ivory Tower, surrounded by Black and brown poverty, all underwritten by the federal government's infusion of capital into pumping dollars to underwrite the tech-based, science-based, biotech, military design-based economy that is driving America through these universities. What it does, though, on the dark side is that you have universities that have been exempt from property taxes because they're providing the public good of higher education, conducting for-private research in buildings that remain tax exempt. So it becomes an economic tax shelter for this kind of work. So as the value of these spaces rises in these tax exempt buildings that are university based, you find in the neighborhoods of color surrounding these campuses that property taxes are going up, that rents are going up, that they're paying greater amounts of the public till when it comes to fire and police, when it comes to public services like trash removal or snow removal. So this huge incongruency between the tax exempt wealth, private wealth of universities, and the additional burden on the part of neighborhoods of color that surround campuses. In Arizona, this has gone even further, where you have public universities like Arizona State University providing shelters to private institutions like insurance companies, right, to locate themselves on tax-exempt public university land, and then the money they would normally pay to the city to support public goods projects is being paid to the university to underwrite private little boutique projects. Like, for example, Arizona State just recently hired Herman, I can't think of his last name, but he was a former professional football coach. So to enable to underwrite or afford his high salary, they use this kind of money to pay $6 million to pay for a football coach for their college game, their college sport. So this is what goes on. This is the kind of publicly underwritten university economy that is pushing forward our current realm of late capitalism. And then, of course, all of this economic development that's happening on campuses is guarded and protected by policing, by private police forces that have been ramped up all over the country that are university-based. One just got passed at Johns Hopkins. Again, UChicago has jurisdiction that goes far beyond its campus. Anywhere that there is a university building, UChicago PD has jurisdiction. This goes deep into Black and brown communities that surround the campus. The consequences of this is that as policing extends into our cities, they have been given public authority and jurisdiction, and they are armed. And with that, because they're private campus forces, they are not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. So not only do they police not only are they only beholden to the Board of Trustees, and they also have public authority, and they're armed, their police stops, their arrest records, their practices have been shielded by not being subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Another layer to that is that what happens is that when predominantly white students in these campuses are arrested for the same or are stopped for the same crime as a resident, those students go to the dean of students while residents get shuttled through the criminal justice system. This has taken shape in what the Campaign for Equitable Policing, a student activist group at UChicago, is called a two-tiered policing system. So if you look at tech transfer, tax exemption, economic development, the private policing of capital, these are the reasons in the present of why we need reparations now. Not even to talk about what's, I'm sure, central to the people here, the uneven and inhumane conditions of labor. And I'm going to pass it off to Adom to talk more about the labor component of this larger landscape.
Yeah. Great, thanks, thanks, Davarian. So I wanted to add one thing about the policing question, which is, well, that it also means that for Black and Brown communities, say on the South Side, they're subject to two police forces, that it's already a neighborhood with the saturation of Chicago Police Department, and on top of that, layered on top of that is this private police force. So, I mean, if you've ever been here, you feel like you're in a military zone, basically. And that's about policing inequality and policing poverty on the South Side, which is deeply connected to the question of labor on university campuses. So what I want to do is say a little bit about, I mean, none of this will be really new to all of you because you're in a union, you're fighting as laborers and as workers on campus. But maybe what I'll try to do is highlight a few campaigns and a few ways we might think about how to think about our position as laborers on campus. One, I would say, I think it's really important to develop analyses and ways of thinking about conditions of labor on campus that connect different dimensions of the university and different kinds of labor at the university. So obviously for academic labor now, we're very clear and aware of the question of casualization and the ways in which you know, forms of secure tenure track labor have disappeared, and we're now in a situation where 70% of you know, academic labor is a contingent labor. We should note that you know, among those numbers, women and people of color tend to be overrepresented. AAUP data also shows that not only are women and people of color overrepresented among contingent laborers, but they also tend to be underpaid. So even in contexts where you're making $2,000, $3,000 a course, you know, if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, you're more likely to be making less. And this has to do partly about the geographic location of where faculty of color tend to be, but even on the same campus as well. So, you know, one thing I'm particularly committed to and thinking about is how we bridge the gap between tenure track faculty and contingent faculty. I think this, you know, there has to be a way in which tenure track faculty recognize that their you know, their conditions of work are deeply dependent on that structure, right? We're not exempt from that structure. And I would say, I think this is a particularly unique moment to be trying to make that kind of argument. And I should say that contingent labor also includes graduate labor, right? That graduate workers who are teaching courses on a course by course basis, who fill in when, you know, who are often shuttled between one course and another without a proper notification, et cetera. That also is a feature of adjunctification. So I think what's unique or interesting about this moment is that a lot of people are waking up to the fact that it turns out that being on the tenure track doesn't protect you when the university decides that deep budget cuts are needed to come up to respond to the COVID crisis. So Ohio University, a public university, University of Alaska, are places where tenure track faculty have been laid off, right? And also laid off in African American studies and women and gender and sexuality studies first. So I think this is created an opportunity in some ways to engage in cross-rank solidarity efforts and to mobilize collectively as academic faculty. I'll return to that question later. But of course, academic workers aren't the only ones on campuses. So I think it's important to think about in this 40-year period as academics having experienced casualization, what have been the conditions of work for others around the campus? So I think you know, most universities, especially large ones, are connected to a hospital, and hospitals are a critical engine of revenue. I think if, you know, this was true at University of Chicago, but true at other institutions too, that in this moment, part of the reason that we're in such a deep budget hole is because the hospital has not been able to do elective surgeries, right? Like, and the revenue of the hospital, even though it's a pandemic, the normal sources of revenue from within the hospital have dried up, right? And this is a huge, huge burden. But I think, I mean, internal to the hospital, we see the same structure of work, right? The most casualized, precarious forms of care work, whether it's, you know, food services, nursing assistants, nursing aides, various things, various ways of saying nurse without the kind of resources and title that comes with the title nurse, are you know, tend to be women of color who work these jobs, very precarious forms of work where your hours are unclear, benefits often don't exist. If there is a union, it often represents nurses, but does not represent these workers. So I think again, because of the ways in which the revenue of the university is so deeply tied to the hospital, I think this could be another moment in which we think about what it would mean to organize across the hospital and academic sectors of the university, how to think those two arms of the university together, even as administratively the university wants to disaggregate the two and distinguish between the two. So, so I think that's another really important thing. So then I want to say something about, you know, as Davarian said, many universities are often the biggest employers in their respective contexts, right? In their respective neighborhoods, in their respective cities. That was true of, I went to graduate school at Yale. Yale was the biggest employer in New Haven. You know, University of Chicago, it doesn't, I mean, Chicago is a bigger city, but it plays an outsized role on the south side of Chicago. So I think there's two kinds of dilemmas then for community members. You know, being employed at the university can be a leg up but the opportunities for local hiring and commitments to local hiring are actually very limited, right? So for instance, at Yale University, I mean, in New Haven, there were neighborhoods where unemployment was 20%, 25% for Black and Latino residents. But most Yale employees, especially white collar workers, so departmental assistants and that kind of thing, were lived outside of the city, right? Lived in the suburbs. Even, you know, even entry level jobs, say in the dining hall, were really difficult for residents to get, in part because credit checks were used as a way of kind of screening you know, applicants. So one struggle both at Yale and here at the University of Chicago has been around local hiring and a living wage, right? At Yale, the way that struggle worked out is that there's unions that represent both the clerical workers and dining and maintenance workers, which is in a federation. So they're both represented by Unite Here, Local 34 and Local 35. So those unions, in their contractual negotiations, were able to get local hiring as part of their contract. This is an unprecedented achievement. One, it requires union members to look beyond immediate self-interest, right? And to think that expanding their numbers and including more of the city in the kind of victories and triumphs of the contracts they've won is actually good for everyone, right? So it was a hard-fought battle within the union to get members to sign on to this. But I think it's a model for those of you who are in unions and have the opportunity to sit across the table in bargaining sessions to think about how can we use these moments of leverage to bring in more workers, right? And to think about a form of unionism that's kind of community unionism or city unionism, to have a wider vision of what the union form is as a political body. In the context of the University of Chicago, the kind of union, the labor union scene is a much more fragmentary one, and so it's harder to do that through the union structures. But what has been a kind of ongoing fight, as yet unsuccessful fight, is a demand for a community benefits agreement. And this is particularly in this context related to the building of the Obama Presidential Library, which is a collaboration between the Obama Foundation, the City of Chicago, and the University of Chicago. It's going to be on the South Side. It's going to be built in Woodlawn, a neighborhood on the South Side of Chicago, just south of the university. Just in anticipation of the library going into that neighborhood, property prices increased 28% in 1 year. So you can imagine the kind of coming of the displacement is already on the horizon, right? So the community benefits agreement is a strategy by which to address a number of kind of concerns. One, to ensure that a certain percentage of all development will be affordable housing. And two, to make sure that there is a local hiring commitment, both at the construction stage of the library and then in this jobs that will be in the library, right? Like the service sector jobs and other jobs that will be part of the regular staff of the library. And also a third piece of the community benefits agreement, as it's been laid out here, is that there will be limits on police presence, especially University of Chicago police, but more generally, that there would be some sort of commitment to kind of other ways of thinking about safety that don't involve having overwhelming police presence at the library. So I think all of these are, ways of thinking about labor that either ties, ties laborers across different, sectors within the university, or ways that the question of labor at the university is tied to that broader political economy and redevelopment strategy of the university that Davarian was laying out, right? So it's embedding the question of labor in these wider questions. I want to say one final thing about academic labor, given that most of you, I think, are graduate workers on campus, and it's just to return to the question of adjunctification. I think last year, maybe, or 2 years ago, there was a bill introduced in Congress by Ilhan Omar, Pramila Jayapal, and Bernie Sanders that was called for student debt elimination, free public college for all, and a stipulation that any university that accepted federal funding through this bill would be required to make sure that 75% of their academic workers were tenure track workers. And I think what is really remarkable about that bill, and I think versions of that, if Donald Trump leaves office, there may be versions of that are introduced. But I think, again, what's so smart about that bill, and I think what we should try to replicate in our organizing and the way we think about academic labor, is that it ties together the conditions of our students, the heavily indebted character of our students, with our own working conditions, right? And helps to generate ties of solidarity and a shared vision of what the university is that we might fight for together. So I'll just leave it at that. And I think now we wanted to turn to think a little bit about some things that would look like repair, and what repair might look like. I'll turn it over to Davarian, and then we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Adom. I just wanted to second the value of imagining the community or the city as the university shop floor, and how that can embolden and strengthen the possibilities for collective organizing and labor organizing for students from a self-interested standpoint. It links students and with a larger world, and people who are ready, especially now, but even before, were ready to be organized, ready to be engaged, ready to organize you about your place within their neighborhoods. And I think it's extremely important. Just real quickly, for example, when we talk about labor, we talked about people who from the community who work on campus. There have been some attempts by some universities because of the push of organizers to say, for example, that right now, currently, subcontracted workers who work for Aramark or Marriott or Sodexo or what have you, when there is a negotiated contract, the benefits that come from the contract it doesn't benefit them. And so there have been some universities activists that push that whatever we organize for should be applied to subcontracted workers as well. And this includes not just benefits on campus or health benefits, it also includes housing subsidies that would allow those workers to remain in campuses as their property values upscale beyond their reach. I just wanted to put that out there. Also, there are tons of science graduate students who are ready to be organized and are upset and demoralized, but feel disconnected from a lot of the organizing that happens primarily in humanities and social sciences. They are being, as we all know, being highly exploited in this new knowledge economy, this new innovation economy, where they are being hyper exploited by the partnerships between corporate sponsors and universities, where if they were in the open market, they would receive sometimes 2 times the labor, 2 times the salary that they get in a stipend, and they're doing the same work that they would be doing if they were working in the private sector, that they're doing as a graduate student, and they're upset and they're angry, and figuring out ways to connect with the exploitation of science workers and the ways in which they're being demoralized around intellectual property issues would be critical for thinking about the city or the community as the university shop floor, a broader sense of organizing. So with that in mind, a couple of things about possibilities. Adom already mentioned the community benefits agreements. That's a reality across the country in certain places. But again, we've seen downsides to that. You have to always make sure that there is a community advisory board that has legislative power, because universities have found loopholes of ways to avoid actually the enforcement of those community benefits agreements. So in anything that we do, there must be a community, not advisory, but legislative board, one with legislative teeth to enforce the decisions and agreements that go on with these CBAs. There have been some schools have engaged in mixed affordable housing, whereby housing for graduate students in expensive college towns and cities is mixed in with affordable housing for community members. That's another possibility. Some organizations, in particularly places like Buffalo, New York, as universities and their hospitals encroach on neighborhoods' land, they have created community land trusts or affordable housing land trusts, whereby they control the land and are able to dictate property values, rising land values in ways that protect them from the encroaching expansion of universities into their neighborhoods. We've seen within food services, we've seen some schools that have engaged in taking unused food from Sodexo or food services, packaging it and distributing it to the neighborhoods and communities. That's happening right now at University of Chicago during COVID-19, but why couldn't that happen every day? Just as an example. Also on the labor side, we've seen, and at the University of Winnipeg, I've seen they kicked out Sodexo and created their own university-based food service company that has a 70% mandate for hiring locally, right? So that's just that's another example. There have been some lost cause historically for university commons, that university campuses should serve as commons for the communities in which they live, that they're permeable and accessible by everyone in the neighborhood. Think what that could do for labor organizing. If neighborhoods saw the university as a part of their community, what kind of allyship could happen or comradeship could happen between the exploitation of community members and the exploitation of campus workers, if this was a part of a larger commons. And then finally, the most obvious things, unionization and police invest, divest, invest. So these are some possibilities that I've seen in my research and in my engaging in collaboration with activists, residents, and university workers. Adom, did you want to add to that?
No, I think let's maybe open it up. I'm sure there's lots of questions, and we can add more as we go along.
Sure.
Hi there. So I'm just, I've opened up the stack. So if anybody has any questions, please kind of send a message, just send me a message to say that, put yourself on step. And we'll put them to, or you can ask them directly yourself to Adom and Davarian.
Talk too much.
Yeah, was it too
You
much?
answered. You answered.
Overwhelming.
It was the self-completing talk.
Excellent.
Everything was answered within itself.
I just want to say that the Q&As from these conversations have been really generative for me thinking about these questions. So just to encourage people to, even if it's just a thought exercise, about possibilities, about organizing, about thinking about these things in a broad way, these really can be generative spaces.
Okay. So yeah, Katelyn's got a question for you.
So my undergraduate, I was at CU Boulder, and I got involved in their restorative justice program, which did a lot of good for the students as offering this way to work through our campus justice and also the Boulder justice program that would like decrease various parts of it, is sometimes wiping their cases off of the record. And so I guess I want to ask more questions of how universities could be super positive in changing the way the justice system looks for both their students and the community at large through things like restorative justice or other forms of alternative governing, if you'd say, alternatives to policing.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start on this question. I think thanks for that, Katelyn. I think what we should keep in mind when we ask this question is that universities have played a central role in the current carceral system we inhabit, right? It is the research of social scientists. I am supposedly a social scientist, but it is social scientific research that propelled broken window policing, right? That propelled this idea of kind of expansion of policing as the way to solve safety. So I raise that because I think it shows the ways in which university research is implicated and imbricated in these questions of racial hierarchy and racial violence. It also suggests that repair could look like, one version of repair could look like dedicating resources to study and experiment with alternative form constructions like restorative justice, like decriminalization. So what would it mean if instead of, I mean, we don't know what university police do, honestly, when they stop people because we can't see their records, but they have arresting powers. So what if every encounter with university police did not just generate a pathway into the criminal justice system, did not lead you to Cook County Jail, but connected you to, one was a process in which certain kinds of crimes of necessity were decriminalized, right? So they did not lead you down that path. But two, that when forms of harm do happen, that there are experiments in restorative justice. And I think this is also very pressing within the university context around sexual harassment and sexual violence. It is very clear that the Title IX structure has failed victims, right? Largely protects the university from legal repercussions, and leaves people feeling powerless, marginal, and with their kind of forms of violence not harassed. I mean, this is quite like the story of sexual violence within society as well. I mean, in Chicago, in Minneapolis, rape and sexual violence crimes are likely to never be solved, right? They're never going to be addressed. So I think you could imagine the university context being a kind of incubator, a space of experimentation around what would be other ways to deal with these forms of harm and violence that then we might scale up to the city. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add to that, Davarian.
Yeah, real quickly. When I was talking to Senator Mary Washington in Baltimore, Maryland, and their fight against Johns Hopkins instituting a police force, one of the first, this is before George Floyd and the radicalization of police activism, anti-police activism. She said in a more modest way, she said, Johns Hopkins is one of the biggest medical centers and most respected medical centers in the world. How easy would it be to pair a police officer with a healthcare professional on a daily basis, right? I think her thinking has moved beyond that now because of what's going on in the world. But even that simple, modest request could serve as a wonderful kind of model for thinking about policing differently. And it foreshadowed what we're saying now in terms of divest and reducing the number of armed responses to certain situations when police are being called to deal with social issues. So there's that. But also, universities are getting millions of dollars, as Adom alluded to invest and data mine police records and policing tactics and the policing surveillance. But there are all these shadow aspects of universities, whether it be these research centers or the police department or the real estate department or the tech transfer division or the foundation, that never have to interface with, say, the restorative justice center, right? So number one, I think it's going to take a deep dive mapping of how your university actually works and where the real money is. Because there's on one side, you have these great projects of restorative justice, for example, that are doing great things with their communities, but they're never touching the real levers of power where universities actually operate in these shadow spaces, where development actually operates, where economic investment operates, where real estate decisions operate, where the relationship between universities and government projects operate. And so I think it's about identifying how universities function and putting these more social justice restorative projects in line or an organization or interfacing with the actual functioning of a university. Also at the University of Winnipeg that I mentioned earlier, as a part of their 70% mandate to hire locally and to hire residents of color, they also target the formerly incarcerated. So what would it mean for contracts to ban the box at a university, for example? What would it mean not just to ban the box, but to particularly target the recently incarcerated, the formerly incarcerated in your hiring practices on top of hiring locally? So I think that these are some things that could be done as well.
Could I just add one thing about where Davarian started around healthcare and connecting, providing services instead of violence. So 2 years ago here at the University of Chicago, university police shot a student who was having a mental health crisis. Not fatally, but the student is now in jail for property damage, who's being charged for property damage, but his trial has not yet happened. And while he was in Cook County Jail, he contracted COVID, right? So, I mean, it's just like this most horrifying, horrible story that reveals the ways in which the university is this kind of microcosm of a wider society, right? We live in a city where our last mayor closed multiple mental health, centers on the South Side. And we like work and teach and study at a university where there are not sufficient mental health resources for all the people who need them, right? So I think, for instance, this is a big demand of the Care Not Cops group, the group at the University of Chicago, which is demanding that part of the reinvestment that needs to happen is to mental health resources for students and for staff on campus.
Yeah, I agree. And I would just say just one last point is that right now in the current economy, the current like landscape, universities are not the microcosm of cities. They're perceived to be the model. With all the damaging things they're doing, they are the ideal. They are the aspiration for what a lot of government officials and financial leaders hope for, including all the things we're talking about. They're the model. So I just want to really emphasize that. And because of that, our organizing, our analysis could be vitally important for shifting the tide. If universities are at the center of people's thinking, let it be our university, the university that we imagine, be at the center of their thinking. So I just wanted to say that as well.
Thank you. I mean, that was a wonderful answer. I mean, again, does anybody have any kind of further questions? Perhaps thinking about this in the context of the University of California, more specifically, I kind of assume that most of the people here are kind of from that, come from that world. But.
I mean, one thing as well is that, I know that Santa Cruz and other very expensive California college towns, there's a huge disparity between the cost of living in those towns and the ability to afford housing for graduate students and students in general, and just regular, like, resident workers who work at the university. So I think, pushing for affordable housing that can attend to graduate workers, local workers, that is a labor issue. That is a COLA issue.
We do have a question from Christelle.
I had a question about basically the implication of concepts such as, I think, Davarian and Baldwin were talking about the university, and also the idea of the global university, and thinking about the implication of those terms in terms of how we articulate the demands that are made to universities, and how do we address the actual imperial scale of US universities rather than local scales of harm or nation scales of harm. And I'm thinking, Adam, you were talking about UC Chicago and how they were like, oh, we were born after slavery. Like they did a lot of like problematic things in the US, but I'm thinking about UC Chicago, like the University of Chicago economies in Latin America, for instance, and how do we address reparations in this regard? The kind of free market policies that were.
It was a little hard for me to hear.
Yeah, did either of you were either of you able to make that?
Sorry.
But I do have another question, and maybe I can ask Crystal to put it.
Yeah,
question in the chat,
would you mind putting it in the chat, Crystal?
Yeah, please, thank you.
We do have a question from Miriam though too, so I'll just kind of unmute her, and hopefully we can hear her.
Hi, I am a PhD student at ASU, and I'm also vice president of our Black Graduate Student Association, and I am also active in the community. I am a Minister of Policy for Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro, and I'm also co-minister of art for Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro. And I know y'all were speaking a little bit earlier to what it means to work in the academy or be a student in the academy, because I'm also a teaching assistant, and then also have so much labor to do in the community. So one of the things that we are asking for we've built a list of demands to our department after we've had these for years now, but now that we've been edited them and we're fleshing them out due to the instances and circumstances that have arisen around this. So one of the things that we are calling for is like a community learning fellowship versus a teaching assistantship, because I think it's often assumed that students want to go right into the academy after they get a PhD, and that's not necessarily the case. And I think it's very limiting of imagining our capacities in real life material time. So I think what kind of do y'all's departments have avenues where students can actually complete their programs and do their community work, where it's like there is that connection in there is that support from the university, or is it always this like hustle bustle halfway, not doing everything all the way right the way you want to do because you're too busy being in service of the university and writing these papers and producing academically, and while your community, you're not putting in the work that you should be for your community as they continue to progress or digress. And like, because I know you kind of mentioned stuff about Movement for Black Lives and universities' connection to it and things like that. Like, do y'all's universities have grants that are given to students who are active in community, or
Or what do you think about that kind of push for the community learning fellowship versus TA-ship conversation?
I mean, the short answer is no. Definitely, like the University of Chicago does not have anything like that. I also think, I mean, so one thing we have been trying to push for at the University of Chicago is a connection between Stateville Prison and University of Chicago. So there's a few folks who've taught at Stateville, or who've also done inside-outside classes that combine University of Chicago students with students at Stateville Prison. But you don't get, like, it's not like that counts as one of your courses or something like that. You know, you just do it because you want to do it. So that's one version of it that we've worked out. I think there's one thing at the University of Chicago that's difficult around connections between local activists and the university. I mean, the university was the site of a very intense campaign to build a trauma center. So for, you know, almost 2 decades, more than 2 decades, the university did not have a trauma center, even though it was on the south side. So gunshot victims would have to go all the way to the north of the city to get treated. And of course, they didn't have a trauma center because obviously that is not a profitable, you know, part of the hospital. They want cancer centers and whatever else. So what that means is that, so the university was the site of an intense community campaign that involved lots of civil disobedience over the course of many years. So it's a really, I mean, I think it's, activists do not want a connection with the university, or they feel their connection to the university as to be a very fraught one. And so I think so I like the idea of like ways of thinking about education that isn't tied to the inside of the university. But I think it has to be I guess those programs have to be designed in collaboration and in conjunction with the activists and organizing communities in and around the university, given the deep forms of suspicion and anger and really like the fraught character of the relationship. But I support it, and I want to hear more about how it's working at ASU, because I think it can be a real model for other places.
Yeah, I agree. You know, my school, I work on these issues. My school is far from the model. So when a lot of times people talk to me, they're like, you know, what is your school doing? Like, my school is not the answer for the things that I'm calling for. And I think there are lots of things that could, you know, historically we've seen this. So in '68, one of the pathways for a number of African-American and Latinx individuals to become professors was they were in the community, and they were community experts and became professors. This is before hyper-professionalization. People like Harold Cruz, other individuals, that's how they became professors. And so I think there's a historical model for this, and it should also go the other way in terms of funding from the university, in terms of rethinking how we evaluate tenure and promotion, that your community engagement should be valued equally, or should be valued in how you get evaluated for promotion and tenure. Right now, it's not, it's secondary, it's extra. And so I think there are a lot of ways in which community and university need to go back and forth in terms of funding, in terms of value, in terms of collaboration. I second Adom's point is that there must be, as I said before, anything that goes on in these community university partnerships must be governed by some kind of community legislative board or governing function, or history shows that they will primarily serve university interests.
Oh, should we answer Christelle's question? She put it in the chat.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah.
Okay. So her question is, do you have examples of demands for reparation that address an imperial scale of harm in addition to local and national scale of harm? Demands for reparations, but also just styles of movement building which address the university as part of an empire. I think it's a really great question. You know, part of the Scholars for Social Justice framework for reparations in higher ed does deal a little bit with the international dimension. It does so through 2 things. One, Davarian had mentioned earlier the kind of Cold War expansion of the university, and obviously this was deeply connected and deeply tied to the military industrial complex. That continues to be the case as, you know, for instance, DoD funding a whole lot of research on university campuses. So one is, you know, supporting the university's connection to American war making. I think a second, obviously, is how the university invests its resources and investment strategies, and where endowments are invested. And you know, I think a lot of campaigns have done some, or like the union movement at Yale, for instance, used to do this with Yale's endowment all the time, like tracing the ways in which kind of Yale's endowment is invested in Chinese mining companies that are engaged in like horrendous labor practices in Southern Africa, et cetera. And I think those, you know, those, at that time we were using that as kind of leverage on other issues, but I think those themselves, in a wider context where endowments are being politicized, those can be really important sites of calling to question the university's investment practices and trying to think about what it would look like to democratize university, you know, university finances, basically. What it would look like to have, say, the board of the corporation board, or whatever the governing body is that is in charge of, you know, making these kinds of calls. What would it look like if university workers had a seat and students had a seat on that board, et cetera? What would it look like if that process was much more transparent and you didn't have to like read, I mean, the way you find this out is reading SEC filings and all kinds of things. I think there's a lot of room for the politicization of those parts of the university that remain hidden and kind of subject to expertise knowledge, right? I'll say one other thing about the international dimension. I think this kind of conversation about reparations in higher education emerged in the context of a you know, in the global context of about a conversation about decolonizing the university, which was, of course, very connected to the legacies of anti-imperialism. And I think one way that has, of course, emerged in the U.S. context is to think about the curriculum and to think about like what parts of the world are actually studied, where are resources spent in terms of research, et cetera. And there's some on the SSJ platform around this too. But it's very striking, for instance, that, you know, area studies, resources for area studies basically follow American strategic interest, right? So it's in the early 2000s, if you guys remember, there was lots of money for the study of the Middle East, of course, in a particular kind of way. Similarly with China, right? But of course, this leaves out, for us, for our perspective especially, leaves out entirely the Black world, right? Resources to study the African continent or the African diaspora, especially from critical perspectives, are shrinking or non-existent in certain places.
In terms of the imperial question, I would just add that there's historical precedence for connecting campus investments in the imperial reach, divestment from South Africa campaigns that were all over. This is probably before a lot of your time, but the divestment from South Africa campaign was global, and it was university based, and then it boomeranged back to a divestment from internal colonial spaces. So campus divestment from prisons and campus divestment from sweatshop labor for like university apparel. So there's a way in which the global actually came back to energize local campaigns within the US borders. I would also add a conversation around, look up more, think about more, some of the social actions that were developing around the building of the NYU Abu Dhabi campus and the Shanghai campus around academic freedom issues, but also around the labor issues, that there were local and also transnational labor networks that were being heavily exploited, that were the ones who were building these campuses. And there was some pushback. One of my colleagues, Andrew Ross, was investigating it, and he actually was on the plane going there to do the work and was told to get off the plane because of some of his investigative academic work. So that's very small, but as we find universities globalizing and not just simply creating abroad programs, but they're actually franchising the universities for very wealthy countries, so that you can get a degree from NYU, Abu Dhabi, or Shanghai, or I think Yale has one. There's a whole education city in Qatar. There is so there are these international outposts, these spaces where universities are clustering. U.S. universities are clustering to take advantage of wealth that they are then shuttling back into their local campuses. NYU Abu Dhabi and Shanghai is funding the overbuilding of NYU in Washington Square Park. So traveling and tracing those relationships could be the grounds for a whole nother plank in campus and community organizing.
Oh wow! I mean, that's incredible. Sorry, I'm just kind of staggered by some of that. But I don't know how. Thanks for your question, says Crystal. Oh, thanks for your answer. Sorry. I don't know if anybody else has any questions. I know we're kind of slightly over time here, but we are kind of free to go if people do have. Well, it's up to Adom and Davarian, but I don't know if anybody has any more questions. If not, we can kind of wrap things up.
I just saw a question on the side talking about what university no longer uses Sodexo. It's University of Winnipeg, as Adom mentioned. And just real quickly, they created their own food service company called Diversity Foods. And they target non-white workers, local workers, workers who they call new Canadians, immigrant workers, formerly incarcerated workers. They are cooperatively organized. They profit share amongst their workers. They don't what I'm trying to say, they don't source food beyond like a 30-mile radius. So this is a model. This food service is actually a model for a more just and humane and equitable university more broadly. So anybody interested, I would recommend you look into Diversity Foods and their practices as a model for labor, for sustainability, for community involvement more broadly.
Well, thank you so much, Adom and Davarian. I don't know if Molly can kind of close us out.